So this month we're celebrating the God in everyone, and for some reason I came up with this title of Can God Be Too Obvious? And I've been working with that, almost wrestling with it. Can God be too obvious? And I wound up coming down on the side of probably God is way too obvious, way too obvious. Well, now, how could that be? Why in the eyes of a minister would I say God is way too obvious? Here in this community, in Science of Mind, we talk about sometimes spiritual beings having a human experience. Oh, spiritual being, kind of like an infused with God being. And so as I worked on that and I looked at some different materials, I started coming up with the notion that really as spiritual beings we're really saturated with all that God stuff. And yet we're these human beings, and so where does the human part come in, and how could that make me possibly think that God indeed could be too obvious to where it would be a challenge or a liability or in any way something to think about as we spend a few minutes here on this rainy Sunday morning? And I'll do that, I'll talk about that, but first I want to do a little kind of a experiment that we can participate in together that'll help give a little insight as to how I walked into the idea that maybe God can be too obvious. And towards that, if you're right-handed, please raise your right-handed. If you're left-handed, please raise another hand. Yeah, okay, very good. So now in order to participate in this experiment with me, take that dominant hand and just put it on your leg or in your lap, and then put your other hand on it so it can't escape and get away. And now what you're going to do is you're going to use your other hand to notice whether your hand that you're covering responds. So if you have an opinion about the political news of the day, then keep your hand down, but notice whether it responds. Do you have a judgment about that? If you have some kind of a judgment about climate change, notice whether you might have a judgment about that. And now we're going to do something a little bit more advanced. If you believe that you have good judgments, see if you react to that. Do you believe you have good judgments? Do you believe you judge wisely? And so, okay, now that's all private. Everyone knows where they come out on this. And so the question that came to me as my human part, this spiritual being having the human experience, is my human part has its judgments. Do those judgments ever separate me from the awesome, infinite, abundant, loving good of God expressing through everything around me? Does this ever happen? What could that be like? And towards that, I started thinking about from the beginning back in the earlier part, the 1930s, of what Ernest Holmes said. And he commented, "We recognize subconscious mind as the great servant of our thought, the medium through which all treatment operates. And this universal subjective mind we contact within ourselves and nowhere else. Being omnipresent, it is in us. Our use of it we call our subjective mind, but of itself it is universal." So that kind of comes close to what I was thinking. So I went a little bit further digging around in the textbook. And I found, through my eyes, God sees the perfection of his kingdom. Through whose eyes? God's eyes? No, through my eyes. God sees the perfection of his kingdom. I too see the perfection of all creation, the beauty of the omnipresent God. So how about that? We're in this really tight relationship, but God kind of relies on our eyes to see it. On the other hand, I think sometimes judgment, at least you know whether you have a judgment capability going on in your being. We've evaluated that just a moment ago. I have a sense that sometimes my judgment capacity has cut me apart a bit from the beauty, the wonder, and the potential of all that is good and all that is God. And so I have a few examples of that I'll share. I can remember way back not to the moment of being born. I know there's programs to get into that, but 3 or 4 years old. And I can remember visiting one summer at my grandparents' house down in Indiana, and everyone was going out. But there was a concern. There was I guess my younger brother wasn't there. I'm thinking back before age 6, and he had not arrived yet. It was just me. So they needed somebody to stay home and watch young John, right? And that fell to my uncle's fiancée, very nice lady. They got married and had children. And I don't know whether I grew into my ears, and like whether they came this big or whether they grew but I had big ears, and I heard the discussion about they were figuring out, like, who's going to take care of the toddler? And no one was especially excited. I don't remember where they were going or what it was. And I do believe there were cool things to do on a Friday or Saturday evening in Indiana, and they were all going except the one person who got nominated to look after me. And so as the evening developed, I guess I was in a mood. And who's ever had a 3 or 4-year-old who had a mood? And this kindly woman decided to ask me what was going on. And so I told her about my judgment that she didn't like me. And then everybody came home and was wondering why my uncle's fiancée was just continuing to sob and sob and sob. And I can remember being called into the whole assembly of all the adults who came home. Like, what happened? As well, she asked me, and I told her I didn't think she liked me. Oh. And, as I look back to a child's judgment, and then the expression of that, probably far from a wise expression. And I would have to tell you that I've worked for decades to get closer to that branch of family. Still working on it. Still working on it. And I think that's a little bit of evidence that sometimes in a world where people are out there to love us and care for us, we can get a judgment. The judgment can become an expression. And it can, there's the road, right? And then the side less traveled on the other side. You can take a side that is apart from all the good, the God, and the possibility and the opportunity. To phrase that a different way, we'll turn to a person who's not necessarily known as a spiritual giant, but I find Joan Rivers interesting, hey? And she is said to have given us this wisdom, that yesterday is history. Got that? Tomorrow is a mystery. Pretty much, okay. And today is God's gift, which is why we call it the present. The present, okay. So, part of it that comes to mind is, judge not and enjoy the gift, but it is this gift, if it is this present, then how do we, at what point is my ability to judge, like the judgment about when to run, or the judgment about when to sit tight, or the judgment about when to keep my mouth shut. When are those judgments good, but when perhaps do those judgments put us apart from what could be just simply God showing up and good things happening? I had another, now let me, first I wanted to just share something that comes from the Bible in 1 Timothy, that the sins of some are obvious, reaching the place of judgment ahead of them, while the sins of others trail behind them. And I wanted to make a demarcation about judgment. It talks about judgments reserved to the Lord and the consequences. And I think that's a different kind of a judgment than when we talk about, do I have the ability to judge wisely? Now, my own perspective is that when people do horrible things, there is a spirit, a God, that does affect judgment, and that people who act in horrible ways have immediate consequences on their soul that are quite different from whether we've got some process to judgment and have all that stuff. So there is the bigger thing about a divine judgment, and are we doing for good, or are we doing for bad, and what does that mean to our soul and all of that. But I'm just thinking about that thing that happens in the spiritual being having the human experience, and that human experience judgment. And is it warning us to run away? Is it warning us that we need to defend ourselves? Or is it just saying be cautious, but also be aware that we're all spiritual beings here having a human experience? So I did want to share a couple more examples that I thought were interesting. They're interesting to me, and maybe some of you will take something from them. I can remember being just early in high school, and I was teaching swimming. And I needed, already back then, I was very planful. I was thinking, college will cost money. To do money, I need to do work. I was mowing lawns. There were only so many neighbors and so many lawns. I was maxing that out. And then I found I could train to teach swimming. And then it was a question of how many swimming classes and how many lifeguarding hours. And so that was the best gig. And I can remember as an awkward, I think we started as sophomores in our high school, as an awkward high school sophomore being out there teaching swimming, and one of the other swimming teachers who went to the Red Cross and got all the certificates was the leader of the cheer squad for the high school. And Sally came over one time, and as things were winding up, started saying some friendly kinds of things. And I was terrified. So I had some judgment thing going on, and I stepped aside from that. And it was only years later that I realized that just somebody reaching out and saying some friendly things might not be dangerous. But then if you've had teenagers in your family, you know what that can be all about. But I do think it's another example of a spiritual being, a human experience, and that little learned judgment factor. And my perspective is I grew up in a family where judgment was viewed as important, perhaps overrated, perhaps. And so I can look back and I can see, like, wow, here I had a chance to get connected to another part of the high school community that could have been interesting. I didn't do that. Didn't go there. Or I can even think a little bit later to after I was starting out in the world and I'd had a couple of jobs and I was interviewing for another job. And I actually interviewed with this company, and the fellow who thought he might hire me had the perspective, like some kind of ability to look forward, backwards, and sideways. I don't know how Joe did that. But he said, "We will be hiring you." He said, "However, I realize that you probably can't understand or conceive of that today. So we'll allow some time and we'll talk some more, but I'm very certain we will hire you." Now, back then I was like thinking, wow, I guess it's an experience. I hadn't found Science of Mind, or I would have said, I've had a mystical experience at my job interview. But it kind of was. The other thing I didn't think about at the time, which practically when I go back and look at it, I was interviewing to work at the Getty Oil Company. And Mr. Getty did have probably nearly as much money as God. And if they decided they wanted to hire someone, they probably had a way to do it. And I also look back at then the lessons I learned inside that environment, which a lot of it was about, humanity and treating associates correctly, a very beautiful experience. And yet, if the fellow I was interviewing hadn't had the wisdom, to say, hey, we're probably going to hire you, but, it may take some time to get there, let it play out. If he hadn't been aware of the way humans interact and how judgment's a factor and spoken to me in an elegant way, I probably would have missed a huge, beautiful opportunity. And I think that's often how it is, because here we are spiritual beings. The universe is a spiritual thing at the core. The only way it takes shape and gets good, bad, and other is when we, making our contribution to God's access to the universe, look at it and color it. And do we report it accurately? Or does judgment sometimes come up and modify that? And another take on that, and I'm not on a campaign here against judgment, only truly judging wisely is a very tender, very sensitive thing to do with the greatest of care. If you walk into the prayer room after a service and you say, I'd like treatment with a practitioner, you've got people who go through quite a lot of training. And much of the training is how to stand aside from judgment. To just simply be able to pray with someone, to treat for them, knowing for the greatest spiritual good to be manifesting. And there's nothing in that operates off of judgment. Only those who can step aside from judgment have a chance to get there. And even if you are in a habit of praying or treating for yourself, it's a good point to consider that for things to manifest, for the awesome possibility that's right here around us to manifest, the first step before the prayer is to be able to step aside from judgment. That's why so many prayers in a Christian way will end with, and God's will be done, not my will, not my human impression of what I could get or what I could do or what I might like to do, but what is the divine expression, the best? And that's only after we step aside from judgment. So that left me back to looking at, from a metaphysical point of view, this omnipresence. Because to me, the fact that I'm saying, be mindful of judgment relates to the fact that Spirit and God are very much omnipresent. So I looked at Charles Fillmore. And as I was looking there in the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary, actually the first thing I noticed was that on my father's side of the family, his mom and the aunts and great aunts used to talk about going to Wilmer. And that showed up as a place where there's all this fusion of diversity in Wilmer, Minnesota in 2019. And that was interesting, Wilmer. And how they would then, on a very special times, they would go on up to St. Cloud, Minnesota. Sounds like a cool place. And then I noticed, and Charles Fillmore is from St. Cloud, Minnesota. Interesting place. So, omnipresence. Charles Fillmore gives us, God is mind. The one mind contains all, and all ideas exist in the one mind. God is everywhere present. There is no place where God is not. He is in all, through all, and around all. Omnipresence is a spiritual realm that can be penetrated only through the most highly accelerated mind action, as in prayer. So some of those phrases from something that was put out in 1931, like there is no place where God is not, God is everywhere present, I'm thinking I've heard that so many times and not always with Charles Fillmore's name. So I think either he seeded quite a lot of it or there's another reference that goes back even further that I haven't found yet. But isn't that quite something, that omnipresence? And here we are, each of us is infinitely connected, but our human experience part is a bit of a finite part. Yet we're so close to the omnipresence. So another example about how that can operate, where we are these humans as we relate and are in community, and yet we're connected to the omnipresence of this God. I'm going to, with permission, take a story from my wife, Joan. She was at a favorite Belgian organic restaurant, I guess you'd call the place, and it was late. And they had some big bags, and she asked them what the bags were, and that was surplus baked goods headed to the dump bin. Because they do a huge business, an enormous volume of business, and they try to have enough so that at the end of the day people can get what they want. They don't like to run out before they close, and so there's some leftover. It's not like a crisis, but it was enough to be a couple bags the one day. And so there's a lot of things you could do about that. You could have a judgment about that and think, they're not as organic and good as I thought they were. You could go all kinds of places. And where she went was, there's a resource. What can we do? And so she went out and researched and found a local food pantry. And, said hi to them. It's run by a church that speaks something other than the gospel of inclusion that we speak here, but nevertheless, religiously managed food pantry. And just chatted with them about where they get their stuff, and they named where they got their stuff and how many sandwiches they like to make. And her thought was kind of like, well, they want to get timed out bread produced in a factory, and then made available when it runs to the end. Or maybe it would be nice, maybe, to get some of this, organic Belgian bakery goods, which bake fresh that day, and then they're out someplace, even if it is the trash, and get those over there. And so she just chatted with people. And I would even tell you, going to this food pantry, the first few times I went, I was uncomfortable. I met people where the little judgment thing in me was wondering, do I need to be cautious here? Am I safe? And, as I just softened up and relaxed, I found some amazing stories and some beautiful people. And my role, and I'm the driver. On a particular night, when the bakery's got significant leftover, Joan finds out. We show up just before they lock the door, and then drive all we can fit in our car over to the pantry, which becomes amazing enhancement to sandwiches the next day. And so I would tell you that my take on whether God's too obvious is that indeed God's quite obvious due to this omnipresence and this fact that we are spiritual beings having this human experience. And my take in the face of that is that our greatest challenge is to manage our ability to judge well, so that we truly receive all the good and all the God that's coming forward, available to us to make the world a better place. So with that, please, join me in knowing that our life as spiritual beings and this human experience is a miracle. And that truly, as we manage our human capacities wisely, as we judge wisely and also receive bountifully, that gifts, answers, and miracles are ours to create, for that's our mission and our ministry together, and so it is.